Cape Kennedy, Florida, the night before the great day.
Tanks now pressurized. 35 seconds and counting. We are still go with Apollo 11. 30 seconds and counting. Astronauts report it feels good. T-minus 25 seconds.
Into the sea.
We got skirt tip. Roger, we confirm skirt tip. 3 over. Roger, loud and clear on the high gain. 540 feet and a 15.
Ha toccato?
No, no.
Sì che ha toccato.
Touchdown. No, no, yes, no, not yet. 10 meters. Now it's touchdown.
Fourth rung up.
I think they're already on the moon.
Non ha ancora toccato.
Hasn't yet touched down.
Adesso fa il ritocco. Ecco.
Ha toccato, ha toccato.
Ha toccato.
There we are. Now they touch down.
Piero Bianucci.
Good evening. Piero Bianucci. We're not as good as Tito Stagno and Ruggero Orlando, but once while I was walking in Paris in the Quartier Latin, I met Piero Angela, and because he still got 2 rooms there since when he was working there for the radio television. You must tell me, because in Rome, Tito Stagno told me that said he gave the news. Yes, he gave the news, but we don't know whether it was exactly right. He was a little early. He was, a journalist, a very good journalist, gives the news before it actually happens. It was very simple. Below the LEM, there were 2 very long, 2-meter roughly, probes with sensors, or this was used by Armstrong and Aldrin to understand when they were 2 meters from the moon's surface, and at that point they knew that they would have arrived or landed or on the moon or mooned very, very gently. When these 2 sensors touched the surface of this, Tito Stagno heard and said, yes, they've touched down. Yes, they had touched down, but in fact, they still could have fallen down. But Ruggero Orlando, who knew this, realized that they still hadn't touched down. But he said there is still 10 meters. No, it wasn't 10 meters, it was 2 meters. So it was a misinformation, but it's something that we know about today, too. In the end, they did touch down. So welcome to GiovedìScienza. This is when we're waiting for the round of applause. And we, as always, we would like to welcome the audience from home. And this evening, we will be talking about the moon. You might have guessed that because it's the 50th anniversary this year of the moon landing. Piero Bianucci was there, not on the moon, but he was working at a newspaper called, a daily called the Gazzetta del Popolo, and he told us about it. So he will bear witness this evening. Yes, I was Giudica Cordiglia, who were very famous there, and they seemed to be capturing the information, but in fact they too were watching television. So I was in Torre Berta near Turin. It was a rest home, but also for psychiatric patients, but let me see this. We can skip the first 2 because basically they're the well-known ones. Here you can see touchdown, and immediately then there was the duel. Ruggero Orlando says no, and then we moved on. Fog on the moon. This is what we saw. You can imagine that you have to imagine that all the television radio shops in Italy and in all the world had all their televisions on. down. And they were queues of people, because maybe there were people who didn't have a set. There were still a lot of people in those days who didn't have a set, and so they would wander in front of a shop. And Italy, well, this is the famous footprint, Armstrong's footprint. He touched down with his left foot. Strange. And then I discovered that Cerdan, when he left, the last one to walk on the moon is Cernan. The last one was the left foot. I don't know why. I tried to ask why. People, is there a meaning on this? Is there a superstition? Nobody knows. But you will have noticed that Armstrong tried the ground first with his left foot, and then he touched down with both. And I can't say which one was first. Here you see the flag. Long discussions on this, because someone says, why clearly is it not a blowing? This was a long one because the Americans were afraid, especially the US government, was afraid that there might be a discussion or speculation on this. There was a competition about various companies that took part in who would have made that flag, and then they had a draw to decide. But we know that that one probably has fallen, and it fell nearly immediately after, because we know that they weren't able to fix it, put it down. And there's been a satellite now that has photographed everything. You can see the flags, not the flag, but the shadow of, because the shadow's very long. The one which is not in the photos, but this one, really, there's something which makes probably either bent or it has fallen down altogether. Well, this one is the only photo, virtually the only photo that we have of Armstrong on the wall, and they're reflected in Aldrin's helmet. Aldrin was going to take photos, but he didn't photos of Armstrong 1¾ but in this case you can see also something which is a little dot, an earth. That's the earth. Why was the earth reflected in Aldrin's helmet at that moment, seen from that point of the moon? And it was exactly there. So yes, they did go to the moon. This is the proof. The proof is in the helmet in this case. They didn't take too many photos, but they didn't get on, did they? Well, Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins were called three very cordial strangers. Well, here we have the Rolling Stones. Oddly, this happened in between two famous concerts, the July the 5th Rolling Stones concert, which I think was about 450,000 youngsters, and Woodstock, another 400,000, which was mid-August. In between, it was the moon landing. It was the university revolts and flower power, the war in Viet Nam, and the fight against it and for peace. In Italy, there was a government led by Rumor. It was a caretaker government. Exactly what is happening now. You saw that red velvet, for example, in front of Collins and Cosmovici. Well, it's still the one which is being used. And here you can see the news as reported by an Italian daily. That's where they landed. And this was photographed from that probe I was mentioning. You can see the sort of spider, the four legs that are on the moon, because they acted as a ramp for the LEM to take off and go back. And this is it here. I don't know if you could draw, and you can see probably the two sensors that were going to touch ground before everything else. And this is something funny. The bag you can see was the bag where Armstrong put the first sample, lunar sample, and there was gravel and stones. And this is something he did immediately. That was his task. He had to gather something, because if it was necessary to take off immediately for whatever reason, at least the piece of moon would have come back with them. And so it was then zipped. One of the first stones by Apollo 11 is the one that you can see in that pyramid. It's a plexiglass one. And the American consul, because at the time there was an American consulate in Turin, had it, and the consul and I went through various schools and through various cities and in various schools. At one point, the bag ended up in a museum in Kansas, and someone stole it. This was then auctioned. It was purchased. Well, I think it came back to NASA, and then it was lost again. In the end, it was purchased by a lawyer for $995, but she didn't know that it was very precious and it was Armstrong's, and she sent it to NASA to say, what is this that I bought? And NASA said, this is something we're not going to return to you, and they kept it. But she was a lawyer. She won the case. She took them, and because it was NASA's fault in all of this, because they had classed it of the Apollo 17 and not Apollo 11. So she had it, she re-auctioned it, she sold it for $1.8 million, but Sotheby's got really angry because they had auctioned it between 2 and 4, so it didn't get a lot, it got 1.8. There's another image which I love very much, which I want to show you. If Massimo Celerino could show it to us now, this is an image. These are objects that arrived from the moon. No, this one left from the Earth to the moon and then came back. There are many versions. It's called Dedalink. She's the one that can be streamed. This is a poster which on Apollo 12 had been stuck up inside the door of a locker without the astronauts knowing. She was a playmate, I think 1967 or 68, August 68. There are various versions. I brought you the one where she's dressed. This is Alan Bean, who then became a painter. He was on Apollo 12 with the poster girl. And here you can see him. This is a self-portrait while he's gathering stones. Now, that poster has still another story attached to it, because on this Apollo 12, there was an astronaut called Gordon, and at the back, she had a false dedication to Gordon, and he went home, and I don't know if in a moment of difficulty he auctioned it. So Dedalint at the end was auctioned for $1,000. But it wasn't this photo, it was the other one, the one you haven't seen. But he was more appreciated as an astronaut than as a painter, yes. And this is the last one I wanted to show you. It's a wall, the type of wall that you could build on the wall, a 3D wall. But in fact, there's another story. Now, at this point, we should have the star. No, don't announce anything. I can't say anything. Nobody knows. There's this story, but this is a long story. I was skipping it. Right, I'll give you the short version. The image that you can see on your right is the one that we all have in our school books. It's the Earth seen or rising on the horizon of the moon. Since the moon always shows the same face to the Earth doesn't rise, but it shows the same one. This was the real photo. It was by Apollo 8. So the real photo is the one on the left, and that's where they were disappearing behind the moon and Apollo 8, and the Earth would have also disappeared. We wouldn't have seen it. They would have lost contact. This is December 1968. But I would just like to say that there were 3.6 billion people, now we're 7.6 billion. There were half the number of people that we have today. I was there and he wasn't. And I don't know, it's a selfie where he's not there. Someone moved. There were about 360 million parts per million of carbon dioxide. We hadn't got the greenhouse effect. Now we're 410, but ppms. But you can see that the gap between the rich and poor wasn't quite as big. Let us stop here. Thank you very much, Piero Bianucci. Well, there's an empty chair there. This was the trick. Well, who will be there now? We have to call a third guest. Or shall we keep an empty seat? I think the person is here, but he wasn't very well. Bit of a cold. Wonder if he's got any better. Let us try calling him. Maybe with a round of applause.
Ciao. Piacere di essere qui.
I'm very pleased to be here.
Allora, io mi aspettavo che entrasse da qua.
I was expecting him to come in, and I said I would have stood up, and I haven't even announced it. Ladies and gentlemen, Adrian Fartade.
Allora,
for those of you who don't know him, I would like to say that Adrian is a historian, history of science, and an expert in astronomy and space exploration, but he's also a passionate person. In fact, when he tells the stories that he knows, he conveys that enthusiasm that he has. And as well as telling us the story around Italy, and this is the first time in 2019, for the second time, and for the first time at the Colosseo Theatre. But normally, and he still continues, you will find him on YouTube. The 450,000 of Woodstock, no, I've only got 160,000. Big difference. Do you sing? No, he doesn't sing. There you are. But these are the people who are registered on your channel, but if we consider the ones who've seen it, probably we exceed the Woodstock people. Well, not altogether. So that's cheating. If Woodstock had been broadcast and streamed, probably it would have had many more visualizations. But we can't compare. So let's be modest. We're here to talk about the moon. We've said a century of moon. Well, only 50 years have gone by. Well, when you study history, your brain initially refuses too many dates, too many facts and figures. But when you spend too much time with other historians, it's different. It's when you're a teenager, suddenly after your teens, you say, that's why everybody disappears in the evening, and that's because they want to go and chat with their friends. That's the same with history. Initially, you don't understand things, and then your brain changes completely because you realize that the things that you see around you, the way in which you see them is through the eyes of you as an observer now, and in 500 years they could be completely different. We say that the Romans behaved in a certain way, but we don't really know. Leonardo da Vinci, only 500 years since his death. They talk about his discovery, but we know where he is. He's in a tomb, in a grave. But we don't really know what he's doing. Leonardo, I was saying, millions of people over the years have gone to see his sketches. If he had known that his drawings would have been considered so good, he wouldn't have forgiven us. He would have been very angry, but we can do what we want with them because he's now gone. This is 2069. When 100 years will have gone by, there won't be anybody here none of the astronauts, but virtually no one who experienced or who lived through that time, so much so that they will have remembered someone who was born maybe then, but no one who can actually tell the story. And this is important because we are one of the last generations that can still be in direct contact with the people who remember. And the fact that you remember that you live at a time that is becoming history is extremely important, because it's the theory of the mountain. If you're below the mountain, you don't realize how high it is, but as the further you go, the more you realize how high it is. And we're still too close to the event. We don't realize what the implications are. Collins is still alive, and Aldrin is too. But they're not many. It is also true that internet, well, of the ones who've walked on the moon, 4 are still alive. One, the most embarrassing, is Aldrin, because it's the first one who urinated on the moon, and he likes to tell this. Yes, he's very proud of it. He's very proud of the fact that he was the first to urinate. And also there was another problem, because Neil Armstrong was driving, and he was a very good driver, but he was too good as a driver, so much so that NASA didn't really trust him. And the basis of the lander was such so that they could be, in fact, compacted, because in any case it wasn't going to take, they were going to leave it there, and only the module was going to take off. So even if the important thing was just to land, it didn't matter if the bottom of it would break. But he, in fact, he managed to land perfectly. So the ramp was much higher than what they thought, because it hadn't been crushed. It wasn't the first step on the moon, it was the first jump. And Buzz Aldrin, when he jumped, he put his foot in a very strange way. So the urine sac broke, and all the urine went into one boot, and that's when he told the story. And he told his friend, don't say that, don't tell anyone that. So mind you, don't tell anyone that this evening. While Collins, who's the one who's Collins, he was born in Rome, piece of Italy, while he was the first one who did not walk on the moon, although he's the only one who wasn't always laughing. But although in an interview he said that he was pleased that he had the best way of returning, because his engine had been tried. That is to say that the engine of the module to take off from the moon the fuel was so toxic that every time it completely ruined the engine, so they couldn't test it. They tested a copy, but that one is, the one that they used on the moon was very, very dangerous. But he knew that he could go back if he wanted to. In fact, in this respect, since you mentioned, we can now show that clip, please. There was a question from the audience, which was, what would you have done, Collins, if the other two had to stay on the moon, say, because the engine didn't work? And this is what he said.
I would say to my friends goodbye, and I would come home to Earth. And now I think that probably we must say goodbye here. Thank you. You've been a wonderful audience.
A questo punto io mi alzo in piedi davvero, così lascio.
At this point, I'm going to get up. So I'm going to leave you the evening, and I hope that you enjoy it.
È una delle più belle, anche perché ci sono tutti quanti gli umani.
This image is one of the most beautiful, because you can see all the people, including Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin, and you can't see Michael Collins because he's the one taking the photo. So this is one of the first images of all human beings. What I love of this photo in particular is, apart the fact that you can see that the Earth is round, but that on that spacecraft the astronauts had taken some small special things. They took, for example, something that they were fond of, but also things that they wanted things to be on the moon symbolically. And Neil Armstrong took a little piece of wood. That piece of wood goes back to 63 years before. He took a piece of wood of one of the propellers of the Wright brothers plane. And so now the Wright brothers plane is on the moon. And when I discovered this as a youngster, it really made me emotional, because 63 years seem a lot, especially when you're in junior high school and anybody over 20 is old. Lots of things happened, but 63 years in the history of humanity is nothing. If they had said, if they had told the Wright brothers that a part of their plane 63 years later would have been on the moon, they would have never believed it. They were people who were alive when this plane took off, who had seen Napoleon. It's incredible. And the other reason why I really love this plane and the story that's behind it is that they had to make it by hand and push it. This is really craftsmanship, and the same thing. Well, they're not made in this way, but also the first planes by Caproni, they're made with ropes, and they're still knots that Caproni tied at the beginning of the 20th century. And the same thing had happened with the first satellites. Here you can see two engineers. You can see that they're engineers because even in the 50s they were dressed like old men. Engineers, always following the fashion, so that it's now vintage. That's the winning strategy. Now it's vintage. Jokes apart, they're working on that first NASA satellite. NASA didn't exist. It was called NACA at the time. Then they changed the name because NASA is easier to pronounce. No, because it had become a space agency and not only aeronautical research. But the most important thing is that that small satellite was supposed to be ready by 1957, but because of various delays, they didn't make it. They really wanted to do it the best possible. You know, the people who get passionate, and maybe you too, who get passionate about something which they've worked on for all their lives. In the moment you have to test it, and you know that you have one chance, you'd like to have an extra day just to have some time to fine-tune it. Unfortunately, they were beat. Then the then USSR beat them to it and launched it. But it was a week before, and it did work. And they'd put, look at them. Have you ever seen an engineer smile this much? Amongst other things, those small panels were the very first solar panels in space exploration made by Bell, which was the one that was in charge of telephones, and that had launched into research and had discovered some of the ways in which you could exploit some particular materials to get electricity from light. And they had tested these, and everything was working. And as in the case of the Wright brothers, this too was handmade. It was put on the top of a rocket. Here you can't see it, but it's very difficult to see people who look at a satellite in such an informal manner. And then they put it at the top of the rocket. Here you can see it. They still had to put, they put this all by hand. It was all very basic. Here you see they're screwing it on. It's about 20 meters high. And at long last, although a little bit late, December, they have the great moment. So imagine yourselves that the whole nation is looking at you. Your engineers. True that the USSR launched Sputnik 1, but this one has more energy because it has solar panels. And it can do better than the Russians. That's what they thought. These are the original clips. Everybody was watching it live, and it was one of the most important moments. Here you can see the video. of how they assembled it. The satellite is much smaller than Sputnik 1 because the rocket that they had was less powerful than the intercontinental missiles the Russians had. Departure and for those of you who don't know a lot about rockets, this is not what should have happened. You should have an explosion, but not a lateral one. Only it should be a controlled one and downward. This does not give you the idea of the degree of trauma this caused, because NASA, you know, when they want to show you that they've done something extraordinary, tried to do it. I'll show you, they said. Well, imagine this. And then, boom, it falls. It's like somebody offering you a beer and tipping it. And here you see, instead of Sputnik, it became Flopnik. And they made fun of them. NASA did not react very well. Other than the jokes, it was simply the delay which it had compared to the USSR. In 1958, they managed to launch the first satellite, the Explorer, with the von Braun project. But in this case, I want to tell you something about the first story of the space. Everybody remembers the moon, but the question is, why should we go to the moon? The moon is beautiful, but why? That was really not part of the history. There had been nothing has happened that can compare. The first race was between the then USSR and the USA for the first spacecraft towards the Moon. We wanted to prove the fact that we weren't able to launch the first satellite, but we will be the first one to launch something outside the gravity field. Here you can see these two objects. The rocket normally launched nuclear warheads, but you can't always have a nuclear warhead, and these are spacecrafts. But here, this was another one on the right, was the R7. If it looks like the ones you see today, it's basically the same. It's been modernized, it's been upgraded, made safer, but basically it is the same rocket. It is the longest standing design. And it was 1958. These were the two satellites. On the one side, you can see on the left something that looks a bit like lasagna, but the one on the right, which looks like a little spiky ball, and like the Sputnik, but it was the one for the moon. Both of them are crafts that were intended to reach the moon. The idea was to get to the moon. It's there. We know where the moon is. What can go wrong? Now, the first ones to launch were the Americans on August the 17th. There's a story behind that, because the Russians thought that they would be first, and on the 1st of August they had a test run, and they were thinking that they would launch on the 15th, but the rocket exploded during the test. They were convinced that they would have been the first ones, and they knew that the 17th NASA would have tried something, but they failed to. Clearly, they were a bit angry when they were watching the live launch, but again, the rocket had a problem, and everything exploded at 16 kilometers, while the moon is at 384,000 kilometers, so they didn't get there. So now the Russians said, right, it's our turn. On the 23rd of September 1958, they launched their craft, but it exploded because of vibrations. This happened. It happened to a lot of rockets. It wasn't a problem, but it's a problem that you have to know it in time, because there are ways to pressurize fuel, but they didn't have the idea that when the fuel was in, it did a bit like a water in a bowl, and it started moving everywhere, and that meant that the rocket also swayed and exploded. They didn't understand why this continued to happen with all the rockets. They only saw them explode. On the 11th of October 1958, it was launched to Pioneer, but the second stage arrived up to 113,800 kilometers, nearly there, but not there. And in this case, the probe measured some things. For example, the particles around the Earth. They discovered that what Explorer 1, the first NASA satellite, thought, that is to say, the Van Allens, were there. They're much more intense than what we thought. And if we want to launch astronauts to the moon, we're going to have to also deal with those with that radiation. So although they didn't get to the moon, they did manage to get quite a few results. Russia, on the same day, launched another satellite that exploded because of vibrations. But at this point, there are 4 missions, and they've both failed. 8th of November 1958, Pioneer 2 exploded and only reached 1,550 kilometers. Russia launched on the 4th of December 58 another craft that exploded because of problem. With the end of 1958, 6 missions have been launched on both, considering the both sides, and they all failed. And this gives you an idea of how many missions and how the fact that going to the moon seemed science fiction. So thinking that compared to 1958, only 10 years after, a mission with humans, Apollo 8, would have gone around the moon and then came back. It was madness. No one would have trusted one of those rockets. But don't tell, except for Yuri Gagarin, saw these and thought, who was the idiot who would have gone on them? 6th of December 1958, Pioneer 3 reaches 102,000 kilometers, 362. The last stages have very difficult because they have to be turned on at very low temperatures in the space. And it's very difficult without control from the Earth. But on January the 2nd, 1959, Lunar 1, in fact, there is a probe that goes close to the moon. Yes, they managed to do it. The then Soviet Union managed to reach a probe at a craft at 5,900 kilometers. It was called Lunar 1. It is the first of the new eras. The others were attempt. We did it on, yes, they exploded. We wanted to see how rockets explode. Yes, the Soviet Union, it was nearly hiding all the missions. None of the missions that didn't work had a name. While the US, they used to broadcast it live, so you couldn't hide it. But one of the things that they lied about was that that mission was supposed to go near the moon. It should have gone to the moon, but every time stage 2 didn't work. This time it worked too well. It lasted too long, and it accelerated too much. So instead of landing on the moon, it went at 5,900 kilometers past the moon. Then they created some mini comets. When they launched them, they were not able to follow exactly where they were. So it is true that you can lose your keys, but imagine that you're going with you lose your car instead of the keys, and it's much worse. So at this point, we found a way with the small containers, nitrogen containers, that exploded, and they had a radio print which was like the comets. So it's romantic to think that we created comets so that, well, no one else finds it funny. Okay, there are people who are moved by reading Milton Boone's or novels. I am moved by the idea of sodium and nitrogen that explodes, and then you talk about engineers. Yeah. On March the 3rd in 1959, NASA 2 manages to get closer to the moon, Pioneer 4, and this time too they failed to catch the moon, although this time they're particularly unlucky because they'd put a sensor to save on energy that should have switched the instruments on only when they were 58,000 kilometers from the moon, and all the instruments would have taken photos and sent the data back. And as you can see at 58,983 kilometers, so none of the instruments were switched on. So close. They hadn't got memes then, but they would have used them had they had them. And this was Pioneer, as you can see. They were like pencil tips. These were some of the last ones made by hand. This is an Italian paper that shows Lunar 2, the first mission that hit the surface of the moon. Were more sexy here in the representation, but there's no atmosphere. The discovery of atmosphere, of how big the Earth's atmosphere is one of the biggest discoveries in the Apollo missions. We knew that it was, but we didn't think that it was so visible, so important. It was the blue planet, so there would have been ocean. Nobody thought that there would have been in fact, the environmentalist movement started with the Apollo movement and the gazes of the astronauts on the Earth. And we realize how fragile it is and how important clouds are. And that, to date, is one of the most important memories that we have, because looking at those images, as well as thinking we're small, we're very, very small, but the Earth itself is a very fragile ecosystem. We take it for granted, but in fact, very often we don't realize things that we do take for granted. And it's a bit like the ghost of Christmas past. That would be disquieting. For example, to think of global warming with the ghost of Christmas past. Well, the Mediterranean was about a meter more here. I come from Tuscany, and Tuscany hates Pisa, so any jokes on Pisa are allowed. In the meantime, in Russia, they had increasingly powerful rockets, and someone might remember the Cannon, the experiments, and the first experiments. Everybody remembers Laika. Laika is the most famous passenger, but Russia sent more than 15 dogs, and most came back. They were launched in the space in a suborbital one, and they came back. Laika is the first dog that was launched in the orbit around Earth. Can you see that dog? That's quite happy, in fact, just come back from space. No problems. This one is asking himself, well, in what sense, you mean the space? Where am I going? The objective was trying to understand if an organism, an animal, could happily survive in space and thrive. Dogs were, because they were trained, and they were very fond of them. And they also fight about who was going to take them out for a walk, because the Soviet soldiers who were supposed to take them out for a game they used to play darts to decide who was going to win, and they were the same ones who were going to launch nuclear missiles, and they were playing darts. There's something disquieting about this whole thing. Maybe it's just me. But going back to them, one of my favorite stories is that of a little dog of this breed called Bobik, who was supposed to leave, and they had trained him and trained him and trained him, and he got used to the spacecraft, and he got used to staying in the dark, and then got treats. Everything went well. Bobik was prepared, and there were 3 days to the launch when Bobic ran away. He'd eaten all the food and had gone. Because they couldn't postpone the launch, so the soldiers went round with tanks looking for Bobic. The idea was not to shoot him, but simply come here, come back, Bobic. And maybe if he heard the noise, he would have come out. No trace of Bobic. In panic, there was panic, everything had been prepared. What did they do? They looked for a dog like him. They found a dog like him, who was probably very surprised by the whole procedure. A mongrel took him, put no preparations, no explanation. They gave him a treat and sent him off to space. And they didn't give him a name. So in the documents, it was only Bobic replacement dog. And it's ZIB, and that was his name. He was only a replacement for Bobic, so without knowing what happened, he was launched into space. His heart accelerated, and in panic, he reached in space. He was healthy, without fainting. When he reached about 800 kilometers in altitude, while he's in microgravity, he noticed that there was a color. Then he starts working on it and presses that button and got food. They wanted to see if he could move in coordinating eye and paw. This was important to know if the astronauts could have, in theory, used a craft in microgravity because of the vestibular system, you know. So if not only did he manage to press this, but he ate all the food, and then the craft started going back, a lot of vibrations, acceleration, and he survived that. No dog had ever survived without any training. He came back, not only they pull him out, they gave him all treats, everything fine. The first thing that he did, he went back to the craft and peed on it. Rightly, that was his at that point. But the story ended up, I haven't got details. I would like to have shown a photo, but there isn't even a photo of him. The only thing that I found is that his trainer kept him. He lived for 15 years, and he kept the name Zip, substitute for Bobic. I told you this because it is true that it has something to do with traveling to the moon. It's important to understand the context in which this happened, because sometimes talking only about facts and figures and competition and objectives, we forget that behind it all there's a human being. This is a deeply human story with anecdotes and moments of joy. You saw the people who were working on them. Those were people who spent their entire life on that little tiny box of circuits. And for all the others, it wasn't important. 2 minutes later, there was another launch. But for them, this was everything. It's now difficult to bring out the human side of it when we look at books of history books. There's nothing on the human side but what you remember, the wars, important dates, revolutions, and I wanted to tell you this just to remind you that if something has to survive, also the human side has to survive in history.
Dovrebbe essere per sostituto per Bobic, se l'è meritato.
Round of applause for Bobic's replacement. So skipping forward, this is Yuri Gagarin's story, and we haven't got time really, and you'd hear me say this, because when I say there isn't time to tell you this beautiful story, look at him, because the organization, I would like to thank Alberto and all the others for having given me the opportunity to be here, but only They said, Adrian, 40 minutes. And I said, yeah, why not? I'm famous because I'm very short. He also came. I have a presentation. It lasts 4 hours. So we will not reach the end, but I will skip. And I will touch upon some of the most important things to reach, well, at a certain point we'll stop. Throw me things. Here you can see the astronauts that were going to become the first in space. If you're looking the one which was going to become the first man in space, it's the only one who is smiling. Yuri Gagarin, while the others are a little bit more concerned. This was the first human being in space. 8 years later, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin were going to be walking on the moon. 8 years ago was 2011. You're old, aren't you? Here he is. And just an anecdote. The CCCP is something they added when they were on the lorry. They said, Yuri, we have launched this 24 times. 12 times it exploded. The others it didn't. And so we've launched it 5 times. 3 times it didn't work. But I know what you're thinking. But the last 2, when it worked, so there's an upward trend. And he was sent to Siberia. In any case, Yuri was launched in 1961, and not even his wife knew where he was going. He said to his mother that he was going very far away. This is the best or worst crack of the story. Where are you going? Very far, mother. He couldn't say where because it was a secret. And so mother heard about it on the radio, and his father was in the fields, and the journalists arrived. You can imagine Piero in a sort of a Soviet version. They say to so your son, Yuri Gagarin, he went into space. Your eldest son. And he said, no, my son is a lieutenant. He isn't, because in Italian, eldest and major is the same. And so he said, well, there's somebody else called Yuri Gagarin who's in space. And all in the bar, because the journalists had gone to the bar, knew about this, and knew that he was in space, and he'd heard everything, and his father didn't know anything. So imagine if you were in his father goes to the bar where all his friends were, and they all look at him, and he said, "You know what has happened?" I like these stories because it's what happens around what we remembered, and they're the first ones that will disappear because the more time goes on, only the core remains. So let us try and remember what surrounds facts and figures. Here you can see what has happened in the US. Have you ever seen cats in space? Here they are. These are cats who were in a plane, and this is what happens when they are in microgravity. This is normal. Now in microgravity. When they're weightless. When they tell you we no longer have, there's some jobs that disappear. Well, for example, a cat trainer for cats in space has disappeared. The cat is very confused but very angry too. We really launched some cats in space. In fact, a female cat, a French one. She was launched and then she came back home, and France also launched a mouse called Hector with a little bow tie. Adorable, very French. And I just showed you this to show you how important, how very, very, very important animals were in terms of research to launch humans in space. This was in the US before launching a human being. This was the first space chimp. He came back. He received an apple for it. He was very happy. And he's holding the paper. never seen someone so happy for having received their salary or an apple. These were the astronauts of the NASA ones, the first 7 courageous astronauts, and they, at the time, it was something incredible because they were all pilots, and they got a letter saying, you must come for a test. Something extraordinary will happen. We can't tell you what. And they had weeks and weeks of tests without telling them why. And then said, would you like to go into space? And most of them said, no, thank you. But let's talk about serious things. But they became astronauts. They were very young, and they were completely mad in a good sense. Many of them had a predisposition. They were problem solvers. You know, for example, those people who, when something dangerous happens, smile because they're called psychopaths. Well, NASA was looking for people like that. But jokes aside, NASA needed pilots who were able to remain calm because they were sending them in missions, on missions where they might have died, and some of them did die. I was trying to talk about things seriously. This was not training. They had to launch them in the desert with a piece of parachute, and they had to survive, learning how to work, getting to know each other, getting to know what the other person's limits were, since they had to go in the space together to discover what you can rely on and what you can't. Here you can see when they were selected. This was before Shepard's launch. Great astronauts, 3 of them will die in the Apollo 1 events, but I haven't got time to tell you, but it was one of the most important aspects because they died because of negligence. This was very important to change the way in which NASA worked, especially in view of more dangerous missions. This rocket launched the first American into space in a suborbital one. Shepard had spent 5 hours there sitting and again had peed in his pants because he didn't want to get down. They would have had to postpone his mission. And he had already lost the name of the first American in space because Yuri Gagarin had got that, and then the chimp had been launched. And this was the decisive moment after they lost the race of the first human being in space. In NASA, they realized that there was no way to beat the Soviets with short-term objectives because the Soviets were further ahead, and they would have managed to reach the objectives before them. The first one in the space, the first woman in space, that was them. The first multiple team, the first space station. All these things were very easy for the Soviets. So they tell Kennedy that they should do something completely incredible, something that would have required so many innovations that even the Soviet Union would have had to start from scratch. They suggested to Kennedy to say that we were going to go, the Americans were going to go to the moon. They would have landed with human beings on the moon, and they would have also brought them home. And the astronauts were very pleased about that. That speech is one of the few cases where the speech was more important in time. In that moment, it was important. Everybody revved up, but they said, it'll be very expensive, we won't do it. Yes, but kick it in the long grass. But those were the 60s. And the U.S., because had problems, as they were saying, civil rights and so on. Kennedy was killed, and his work remained live in the U.S. imaginary. It's not against the USSR. He doesn't even mention it in his speech. The challenge was not against someone else, but against oneself. What he does in this speech was that he said, let us show what we can do with science, technology, with our commitment working together. If we can't do something that extraordinary, maybe we shouldn't go around saying that we are able to do something. This is different from saying we will beat the Soviets, because the Soviets didn't even answer that. They said, we're not interested in the moon. The first time they start talking about landing on the moon was 4 years later. So NASA wasn't competing with the USSR or the then USSR, but against itself. This is very important to understand why they continued, and also they involve 500,000 people in this effort. It is one of the greatest technological exploration, if not the greatest, in terms of innovation, and most of the people were 20. The first thing that NASA complains about is that there are not enough students. There are not enough people, and not enough. The problem wasn't illiteracy, but that people used to stop school and not going up to university. One of the first impacts of this decision is that the budget for education was more than trebled. That idea of investing in education and scientific literacy of all that generation means that the generation that was born in the 60s had enormous incentives, and that the education system exploded, not in the negative sense like Italy, but they exploded in a good sense. And this had a very important impact. Why have we got Silicon Valley in the States? Why have we got IT companies? Why was Google not started in Europe? And it's not only a question of tax. It's also the enormous investment in education and technology. So, if there is anything that we could imitate, this is it. Because if we have this example and we continue to say, not important, so much so that our decision of the Italian government, I have no interest in talking about politics, in the next 3 years they're going to cut 10% of all funding for education. And this breaks my heart, because we have examples of how things work and why they work. But I must run. Super fast. Three rockets, 3 spacecraft. We're going to the moon. Not a nice person if I go this fast. No one knew how to go into space or even into the moon. So NASA started with the Mercury with 1 person in the space, Gemini, the bigger one with 2 people, with the idea of hitching on and unhitching an Apollo with 3 large pieces, the command module, where you can see the astronauts, the Lunar Module, which has a smaller one for landing, and the other one for going back and to go back home. These are the 3 great pillars, and all of them start roughly together because they had different and longer time to develop. Mercury is simple. To manage to do the giant one, you require much more time, and many of the first prototypes didn't work. But this was the starting point. One of the first big missiles that were launched was the Redstone. It was called the Redstone to give you an idea of how much bigger the other ones are. You see, this one is 25.4 meters. It has a mass of 30,000 kilograms and a diameter of 1.77 meters. But kilometers and meters are a bit abstract. It's not that easy to identify with them. And since I'm in Turin and I'm in GiovedìScienza, I chose to create a new unit of measurement for you to give you an idea. Piero Angela, and it is a PA, we will call it, a new universal measurement that we will offer. One Piero Angela, one standard Piero Angela, is 1.77 meters, weighs 75 kilos, and so this rocket is 14.3 Piero Angelas and has a mass of 400 Piero Angelas altogether, and a diameter of 1 Piero Angela, but tilt. So this is the rocket. These are very primitive looking and very funny looking. Piero Angela. These are the missions, the robot missions. This is a film that they were stolen. Here you can see this is a very beautiful story, but it's the first woman in space, Valentina Tereshkova. And since I wanted to mention the stories surrounding the main characters, the one to the right is her training partner, who trained with her and was a reserve, and no one remembers her because she never flew, and because after they had obtained the first place in women in space, 6 women trained, and they all had results that were equivalent to men's. But since they were women, all the program was cancelled, and then men were called again. True. Von Braun, nice. Von Braun, as well as being a Nazi, and it's one of those things that you don't really want to start your CV with, was very good at building rockets. And so after Valentina Tereshkova, the Americans said, when will we have a woman from NASA in space? And he said, well, I suppose that at a certain point we will launch some stations, some commercial activities, shops, restaurants, hotels, and then we will need maids. Ooh. Ooh. You can belittle him. He's dead or disappeared, but dead, I think. Just to say that at the time, the story of Valentina was very important because for the first time, also girls in the West saw Valentina and started to say, wait a minute, she went into space, nothing happened. So when you can say women can't, why can't they? She did. And this seed was very important for all the things that happened in the 60s and 70s for civil rights. The history of what we do, extraordinary evidence, is not separate, distinct from other things. These extraordinary, wonderful gestures ended up on covers and were very important to give the human dimension of how we see each other, how we see ourselves. And all this is intertwined with the battle of civil rights to create a better world. NASA launched, I like these photos because one of the engineers has a box and the other one is looking at them. Oh, so I'd like to say, this should have been inside. And it's like when you assemble one of the IKEA pieces of furniture and you just have extra bits and you don't know whether they should have been inside or not. In any case, that was the first probe of NASA's that managed to hit the moon in 1964, only 5 years before the first lunar landing. This was the first image of the surface, and the scientists and engineers were very worried because in this resolution you can't see anything below 10,000 kilometers. And if you've seen a human being, it's not 10 kilometers in height. So any stone might have completely, so you need missions that were much closer. And they were only 6 years to the end of the decade, and so they began launching tens of missions. Every week they had a mission. But there's no time to talk about this. Buzz Aldrin. Here you can see in one of the first beautiful selfies with a Gemini when they were testing their suits to walk in space. This is the end of the Gemini program, and so they wrote the end on their backs as they were going towards the ramps. Do you remember the Apollo 8 mission? They asked NASA to give a name to their spacecraft and call it Columbia in honor of Jules Verne's missile that arrived on the moon. And NASA said no. They were a bit afraid that they would all die, but that's another story. The reason why the Columbia of Apollo 11 didn't do it because they with Apollo 11 had convinced NASA, and they chose the Apollo 8 ones. So there's a piece of story of science fiction that then moves into story. And the first mission on the world, this thread between Jules Verne's science fiction and the actual mission, it warms my heart every time, for reasons that are totally irrational but very beautiful. Jules Verne would never have imagined that we would have had a mission with the name that he gave for his imaginary craft. Here it is, von Braun with the giant ones. One has been just for Bezos, in fact, the head of Amazon, the capo, I would call him, and it is, he recovered it from the ocean for his own personal museum. Here you're explaining this. Here you see, you've seen it was launched and then it turned round. It hooked on. This was very important because it had to hook on to that, and this maneuver, the turning round, was the one that they had to try again. And usually it didn't work, but NASA was quite sure that it was its simulators that weren't safe, because it worked very well when they were in space, while in the simulations they died. But the astronauts were not really convinced of that. They said, don't worry, the simulator always said that you'll die. You see that it'll all be fine. This is the lander and the surface, and they were enormous, these rockets. They lovely stories about how they created them, but no time. Notice that there are cars below, so you understand how big it is. Here, these are the size, 110 meters in height, 2,970,000 kilograms, and a diameter of 10.1 meters. So very difficult to embrace. And it was used only for 7 years. Look at it here in our universal unit of measurements, 62.1 Piero Angelas. I don't know what 0.1 means in a Piero Angela. Mass of 39,600 Piero Angelas. We could have like an Italian small Italian city, and a diameter of 5.7, and again you have to put them sideways. And years of activity since Piero's 90, I calculated 7 years are about 8% of Piero Angela's life, which is the time of activity. The first to be launched were these, and these are while they prepare for their journey. When they were launched, another incredible story that they used to say when you're preparing, we will go kilometers from here because if it explodes, we will all disappear. Then they lock them in. Bye. And it's full of anecdotes. Michael Collins, when he walked in on the ramp, he gave an envelope with a trout, because they always gave him things. And Michael Collins, for a joke, this would have been giving him a trout, because he said, once I came to your house and we heard that you hadn't fished, without any explanation, and he just gave the manager of the launch. And if you saw the movie First Man, which was Michael Collins, the actor, has a paper bag without any explanation. But if you see it, that I know what's in that bag. It was a trout, and all the people around him saying, "What the hell is he giving?" And here, while NASA had also written liquid oxygen, no smoking. And the thing that I would like to conclude with is the three of them are alive, the Apollo 8, but the thing I wanted to tell you here, Michael Collins doesn't smile. The first there were two tortoises that Soviets didn't disappear in the meantime. They launched some tortoises on the moon in September '68, so 51 years ago, and there are two. They arrived, they went around the moon, and they came back, and they were healthy. the tortoises that had always been the symbol of being slow, they now become very, very fast and gone round the moon. They also launched some Drosophilas that came home, and they were a group. And in one of the Soviet papers, they mentioned the fact that maybe they mated during the journey. That also is something that they were the first ones if you decide to be an astronaut and want to have sex. But there are many other things that you can do. But the tortoises were launched to test the spacecraft that was nearly ready, and this N1 rocket was nearly ready. The Soviet Union had all the things they needed, and they might have beaten the Americans, but the problems were hydraulics. The rocket was perfect, but was too complicated. These were the engines, and for each one, there were tens and tens of pipes all crisscrossing. It was enough for one of them to stop working to send everything haywire, and all the 4 launches failed, unfortunately. So in the end, they stopped. But they also had a lander. This was the lander that they had for the moon, and we know that Alexei Leonov would have been one of the astronauts who was the first one to walk in space, and he was the prime candidate to become the first man on the moon. So in a parallel universe, the USSR would have been the first on the moon, and I don't know what have happened for NASA. Maybe they would have gone to the sun at night. But the thing that surprises me most of this whole story, it's very late, I know, these women, have you ever seen this photo? No, these women are the women who sewed the astronaut suit by hand. NASA sent them the designs and the drawings and how they had to be made, but a lot of things didn't really work. For example, those women sewed them by hand, and they were the first ones before the astronauts to try them. And they discovered, for example, that the knees weren't very easy, they couldn't bend, and if they fell down, they couldn't pick themselves up. The sand could have had a negative impact. They changed a lot of things, and they sewed them by hand, and no one remembers them. And they were one of the most important pillars that determined the survival of the astronauts. But it wasn't the story that people wanted to hear on television. But now it's 2019. 50 years have gone by. It's true that we can stay here and be nostalgic, but we must also say that things have changed in the past 50 years. This should make us angry. A bit in delay. It's a delayed reaction, 50 years, but it's important that we should understand how, at the time, this extraordinary thing was done in worlds that were full of prejudice. And this one here, do you remember her? Margaret Hamilton. She programmed the computers. There should be schools named after her. While the astronauts were called everywhere, she wasn't called anywhere. This is tragic. For a lot of people used to say women not suited for IT. IT is for men. When women have, in fact, they invented languages. COBOL, one of the first ones, was invented by a woman. Margaret Hamilton was key in this history. I haven't got time to talk about it. Mary Jackson also, who worked at the overall management of the mathematical calculations behind the trajectories. And if you go and see the movie, now all these stories were pushed to the side. You can see some stories or some clips of journalists who go to ask the wives of astronauts what they're going to wear that day, what hairdo, because that was the role of women, being home while the astronauts were going on the moon. And the same year, these were the things that were happening. That's a child who is dressed up as a Ku Klux Klan person. There was segregation. Blacks could not go to the same schools as whites in 1969. The same state that is a nation state that is sending people on the moon is the same one where black children can't attend the same school of white ones. So this is a an African-American girl accompanied by the police to go to school. The same year, we have the Stonewall events. That is to say, it's 50 years since LGBT rights have started. Those people who are kissing in the street were then truncheoned by the police. Nowadays, we live in a world that is better in many respects and still has a lot of problems, but it didn't happen just by chance. It was because while these things were happening, many other stories were happening at the same time, and they're all intertwined, because when these people saw these men going to the moon, and when they went up to the moon and spoke about a small step for humanity, everyone at home felt and heard those words and thought of what the better world would have been for them. And it can't have been us on the Mars, us on the moon, us in the universe. I agree, this is the world that I like too, but this will not happen unless we work together, if we don't cooperate, if we don't love each other, if we don't forget discrimination and hate, because we no longer need a race. The space race divided us, separated us, and also took a person to the moon, and 50 years later, we only have one rocket that can launch people on the space station. We didn't go back because it was a fact that existed only on the basis of a political promise. But what has really happened? What has really happened is not just people or humans on the moon, is that in the gazes of these people looking at the first people on the moon, doing something absolutely impossible, had the courage to do something which would change the world. Because if 12 years after launching the first human you can be on the moon, what can you do? What can you obtain if you fight for a better world for our rights here, with the same hands with which we launch rockets? I swear this is the last one. You do recognize who this Italian is? The Italian who is... does anyone recognize him? Ungaretti. Ungaretti, with a beer. He's looking on the moon. He managed to see human beings on the world. And here you see he is vying for humans on the moon, pointing to the flag. When there are photos of Ungaretti at school, I always think of these. I would like these to be the photos of Ungaretti. Is it a bottle of wine rather than beer? Well, very Italian in any case. Here, she's Valentina Tereshkova. He's Neil Armstrong, first man on the moon, and they met during Armstrong's tour in the USSR. If I had Xavier's power, I would read in people's minds, I think that each one is smiling for a completely different reason. And Neil, he could end up in Siberia if he's not careful, but it's adorable. This is the photo I'd like to finish with. In 1975, there was the joint mission between Apollo and Soyuz, the USSR, and you see, they were in space. This is Slayton, a NASA one, and below Alexei Leonov from the USSR, that embrace and cry and exchange food and simply acknowledge each other. They know how many people died, what the difficulties were, how many problems there are on the Earth they've left behind them, and because they're going to go back, and they come from countries that have many problems. But for that instant during which they embrace, something magic happens, something magical, because they are not US and USSR. They're two human beings, two plain human beings, embracing and are moved because they've done something extraordinary. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Grazie davvero.
Adrian Fartade.
Grazie. Sì, quella che vedete è perché, sorpresa, io ho la febbre, però nel frattempo è uscito il secondo libro
I
in
have
prevendita
temperature
su
today,
Viet
but there's a
Nam.
second book
Questo non lo può
which you
firmare
can...
perché lo può
He
prefirmare.
can't sign
Però ho
this,
parlato delle missioni Apollo,
but I
delle
spoke
missioni- di tutte le
of the
missioni,
Apollo
questa sera
missions
non
and
ho
all
avuto
the
tempo.
missions
Le
which
trovate
I was
nel primo
unable
libro,
to
che è Giorni
talk
su
about.
Marte,
You'll
che rifà
find
fino
them
alle storie delle
on
spazioni
my
di
first
Marte,
book, Adrian
tutti pianeti
Fartade.
e questo racconta
It's
la
Barefoot
storia
on
di tutti gli
Mars,
altri
and this
esteri.
tells
E
the
prima di
story
andare
of
via,
all the
facciamo
others.
una
And
foto
before
insieme,
leaving,
visto che ho visto
I would
diversi
like
di
to
voi
have a
si alzano.
photo together because I see that
Facciamo una
several
foto
of you
che
are
poi
getting
vi
up.
avviso
A
sarà
photo
conservata
which
per la
will
memoria
be
futura in una capsula del
conserved
tempo
for
che verrà riaperta nel
future time in a time
2257.
capsule which will be opened in 2000
Dal lancio di Sputnik
in
1
300
sarà
years.
messa stampata e messa in un baule
It will be
antiatomico
printed
alla
and
Biblioteca
put in an
Nazionale di Firenze.
anti-atomic
Quindi, tra 240 anni
trunk
vi
in
vedranno
Florence in the
guarda queste
museum. So in
stravede.
247 years
Non
they will
avevano
see you and
neanche le
see,
parrucche che
look
persone dopo
how
civiltà.
funny they were. Look how they dressed. They weren't
chi
even
vuole
wearing
fare
wigs. Let me
Adrian,
see
io
who
ti
can
dico che
take a
sono un
photo.
ingegnere.
Adrian, I'm an engineer.
Adesso ho questa responsabilità.
Questo è per farci
So I now
sorridere.
have this
Potrei
responsibility, and I could seek
C'è uno in
revenge.
fondo che si è mosso.
Someone moved at the back.
Sto più indietro, non prendo. Ma secondo me qualcuna
Vai.
buona c'è.
Perfetto, grazie.
I think there might be a good one there. Thank you.
Una domanda. Dimmi.
There's a question.
Prego,
Please.
non si sente?
I'm sorry, we can't hear it.
Adesso si sente.
Buonasera, il mio
Good evening.
il mio nome è Luigi.
My name is
La mia
Luigi.
domanda era,
My question is,
perché sulla Luna si sono
why
trovati oceani e
did they
terre
call them
e non
oceans and land on the moon and
Bellissima
not
domanda.
vice versa?
In realtà
Very
perché
good
all'epoca,
question.
quando
In
li hanno
fact,
visti,
because at the
non
time when
sapevano
they
di
saw
preciso
them,
cosa fossero.
they didn't
Avevano
know
visto solo delle
whether they were
lisce,
seas
delle
or what. They
distese,
just
lisce,
saw some
erano molto
smooth
scure,
areas. They were
pensavano
very
che
dark,
fossero come il
and
mare.
so they thought that they were a bit
Galileo,
like
quando
the
disegna,
sea.
sa
Galileo,
solo
when
delle
he
distese
drew
lisce.
them,
E
he
la
thought
cosa
that they were
rivoluzionaria che
smooth,
scopre è
and the
che le
revolutionary
montagne
thing that he
intorno a noi,
discovered was that the
perché non era solo
mountains
per le
around
macchie, molti
had
pensavano fossero
a
solo delle macchie su una
had
palla
shadows, while others had
Vedete,
thought
scopre
that
che in realtà no,
they were
quelle
just
sono lisce, ma
marks.
non ci sono montagne. Abbiamo
He
scoperto dopo che in
discovered
realtà
that there were
sono vaste
mountains,
distese
and we
di,
discovered that they were vast
roccia. E
plains
ti faccio
of
vedere una cosa.
rocks.
Vieni, avvicinati.
And I'll show you something. Come
Ah,
here.
sorpresa.
Surprise.
Perché parlare di queste cose e basta quando puoi toccarle, giusto? E
You can
ti ho
touch them.
portato? Beh, no, a te
I
in
brought,
particolare, ma
not
magari
you in
sì.
particular,
Zan, zan, zan.
or maybe
Vieni,
yes.
vieni. Allora, come ti
Come and
chiami?
see.
E te?
What's your name?
Allora,
Luigi.
venite entrambi qui, giratevi. Questo a volte esplode, quindi
And here,
no,
sometimes it
scherzando.
explodes, so I'm going to move away. I'm
Questo
joking.
fragmento qui
Touch it.
viene dalla superficie della Luna.
This fragment
È
here
letteralmente un
comes
pezzo di
from the
Luna.
surface of the moon, and it's literally a part of the
Esatto,
moon.
bravissimo.
At this point, you should do, oh, you should go, oh, yeah.
Pensa, ha 4 miliardi di anni. È più vecchio di qualsiasi cosa sulla
4
Terra.
billion
Gli
years
astronauti hanno
old.
portati diversi
It's
giorni
older than
insieme, ci
anything
sono
on
storie non
Earth.
solo
The
della Terra,
astronauts
perché
have brought
c'è
back
solo la
lots,
Luna,
which have
anche
told
i
us a
piccoli
lot
Terra.
about
E la
the
Luna
history
è
of
stata
the Earth and of the moon. And it's like, moon is like a giant library. If I told you we've discovered all the books of the Alexandria Library, would you not be curious? The moon is literally that. It's known that we have been there, but we've only just scratched the surface. And all the things that have happened, all the mineral traces are there. So what happened on the Earth and then has been erased has left the sign there. So it's up to us to go there and to find all the signs that we need to. You can touch it again. And on your finger, you still have atoms. So if you touch your nose now, or if you touch someone else on their nose, you touch people's nose. No, it's certainly not a 0-mile product. If there are no other questions, I would like to thank Adrian. Thank you so much.
Una cosa vorrei dire, sarà che non ci siamo capiti sui
One
temi,
thing I'd like to say,
mancano ancora 50 anni.
There's still 50 years to go. 50 years to go. My fault, I'm not very well. Yesterday I had a temperature and I've got a cold. So I had a temperature this morning. I came here, I felt as if I was going to faint. Fainting is like your body disconnecting. I didn't faint, luckily, but I didn't get to as I wanted to talk about the other 50 years. So Adrian has to come back and tell us the next 50 years. The sequel is coming. Well, we will reconvene next week with Vittorino Andreoli. And thank you to you all, and thank you, Piero Bianucci. Thank you. Bye.